Okay, so our last lecture on imperialism is going to cover imperialism in Asia and the Pacific Islands and sort of what the countries did and where they took over there. So I want to start with Japan. So Japan is interesting because Japan, unlike the rest of Asia, really has isolated themselves for a long time. And the Portuguese and the Dutch were the first to really get to Japan from Asia. They were the first ones that were really allowed to go there. However, even though they had trade relationships with the Japanese, the Japanese decided in the 19th century that they didn't really want to deal with that anymore. So they kicked them out, right? They kicked out the Dutch, they kicked out the Portuguese and said, we're going to work on building our own government. So for a while, they work on, like I said, building up their own industry. They industrialize more than the rest of the world, and really just sort of set up their own government, for lack of a better word. Now, the Americans show up to Japan in 1853 and basically try to open up Japan to the rest of the world. So they're led by a guy named Matthew Perry. You know Matthew Perry, right? On Friends? Yeah, no, not that Matthew Perry. This Matthew Perry, right? Matthew Perry was a American politician who basically said, Japan, you need to trade with us, right? Stop isolating yourselves. And they used what are called gunboat politics. Basically, they showed up with all these big boats. It's called the Great White Fleet, and you see it in the picture up here. And they said, please, Japan, open up. Now, they didn't threaten Japan. They didn't go in there and say, you better open up or else. But the implication is there, right? Like, look at all these major guns that we have. You should probably open up, right? Which is exactly what they do. So they open up a little bit more, but however, they do avoid colonization because they had already industrialized. And in fact, Japan themselves becomes a colonizing power. So if you look at this picture here, you can see that Japan is using Korea to go to Manchuria. So they do actually colonize parts of Asia in ways that are similar to the European powers, but that's how they avoid colonization themselves. Now in China, it's really all about trade. So the problem is China has a lot of things that Europeans want. Tea, sugar, not sugar, silk, tea, silk, porcelain, China, right? However, China doesn't really want anything from Europe. There's nothing that Europe has that China really needs. So trading becomes quite difficult. So the Portuguese are allowed to trade first. They get trading rights in China back in the 1516s, vowed very minimal trading relationships. But then in 1794, the British show up. So they show up under a guy named George Macartney. And of course, there are a lot of cultural misunderstandings. So basically, Macartney goes to the emperor and he's like, we'd like to trade. But he wouldn't bow to the emperor of China because he only bowed to Queen Victoria, which the emperor took as like this really big insult. And so he said, you got to get out, right? Well, the British come back, and this time they come back with gunboats. They come back with weapons, and they basically threaten China. So China allows trade to open up. It's going to lead to a lot of issues, though. There are some rebellions. There's a lot of conflict and war. The British decide that they are going to trade opium with the Chinese. So they basically get the Chinese hooked on opium so that they will buy opium from them so that the British can buy tea from China. It's a whole big mess. We're going to look at that more specifically later on, but yeah, it's a lot of issues. But what ends up happening is the Chinese give Europeans spheres of influence. So they don't actually control China, but they have territories in which they control the trade of China. So that's kind of what that's all about. So spheres of influence mean European countries control trade, not the country themselves. Now in India, things look a little differently. So initially, India is way too hard to colonize. It's too expensive to get there. Communication back home is way too difficult. And so for a long time, Europeans kind of let India be, right? However, that starts to change. So the Dutch are actually the first in India. They hit the island of Java as part of the Dutch East India Company and start to gain some land there in return for some local support. But really, this is, again, mostly coastal trading. Then the French make their way there and start to control some areas. And finally, the British make it. So the British take away all of the Dutch and French territory after the 7 Years' War in the 1760s and set up the British East India Company. So the British East India Company works with local rulers in India, kind of trading with them, and set up what are known as the British Raj. So these are local independent leaders who answer to Britain. So Britain controls the colony, but they let the Indians sort of run things themselves as long as they run it in the way the British want them to. This is an important distinction from what was going on in Africa. So this is indirect rule. Africa was direct rule. So they're letting a lot of the locals kind of rule themselves. In 1858, they passed an act called the Act for the Better Government of India. Basically, the idea is that there are going to be more British people moving into India in order to rule all of them. Obviously, if you look at the ratio of British to Indian, it's pretty big. There is a rebellion as a result of this. A lot of people get really upset, and it sort of strengthens the British control. The British go in, they crack down on the rebellion and say, all right, we let you guys rule yourselves for a while, and you showed us you can handle it, so guess what? Here we come. This is known as the crown jewel of the British Empire. It was their most important colony, mainly because of the cotton trade. It was known that India cotton kind of created some of the best fabrics, and that was where they made tons of money. The Chinese trade was also filtered through India, so it was very important. And the British were very proud of their colony. In fact, Queen Victoria was known as the Empress of India. Right? So you can see Indian influence in all of British society. Up here we see Queen Victoria getting her Indian crown when she is crowned emperor or empress. Over here you can see some cultural things in this fancy British man's home that are related to India, as well as an Indian servant. Down here, you actually see that Queen Victoria herself had an Indian servant, a man named Abdul, who actually served her in her later years. And up here, you can see the British Raj, right? So these are all local Indian leaders, but then you see the one white guy in the middle, right? He's the British guy that's really in control of the situation. And in the end, all of these guys have to answer to him, who then answers to the Queen. Now, there were some reforms that were attempted in India. There was some secondary education that was given, so higher education for the Indian people. There were also some economic developments in the area, irrigation projects. They built a railroad, 225,000 miles of railroad. It became the fourth largest cotton industry in the world. They also set up tea and jute plantations. And so they tried to kind of develop it a little bit more. Of course, they got something out of it too. They also had a unified and very powerful central government that the British were controlling, and this is important because unlike Africa, which had lots and lots of different kinds of governments, this one kind of allowed the government to sort of be a little bit more structured. However, a lot of this causes a lot of problems. So over the years, there's going to be overproduction of non-essential crops, right? So tea is not something you need to survive, right? However, they're basically encouraging the Indian people to grow only tea. They don't grow any food, right? Well, eventually it exhausts the land. It strips all the nutrients out of the soil. And when it strips the nutrients out of the soil, it causes a famine, and there are no crops for anybody. So that's going to cause a lot of poverty, especially among the native populations. Then the British institute taxes. The taxes in India are very high, and it causes a lot of issues. In 1885, the British established what's called the Indian National Congress. So this sort of trained local Indians to rule like the British. It educated the Indians, mostly Hindu. There is a whole divide between Muslims and Hindus in India, which we'll get into a little bit later. But eventually the Indian National Congress got too smart for their own good, right? At least according to the British. And they eventually organized to demand self-government. And this is going to be essential in the decolonization process later in the 1900s. The Indian National Congress, with the help of Mahatma Gandhi, is really going to be what gets India away from British control. So next we have the Pacific Islands. So in the Pacific Islands, we've got a few colonies here that become important. So first of all, we have New Zealand. So at first, the British were kind of scared of the local people of New Zealand, the Maori. And if you look at them down here, they're kind of scary looking dudes, right? I wouldn't want to deal with those people either. So they kind of held off on New Zealand for a while. However, they do move in the 1850s. They bring in a lot of agriculture to New Zealand that was not native there in order to kind of increase British agriculture. The Maori try to fight back. They are unsuccessful because they don't have the technology that the British have. So instead, they go to court. They basically sue the British. And they managed to win back a lot of their rights in court. Now, that is not to say there is still not a lot of discrimination against the Maori. There are a lot of issues that happen against the Maori, but this is a really cool example of the Native people using British courts against them, right? Next, we have Australia. So Australia was discovered by a guy named Captain James Cook. And essentially, when they first got to Australia, they didn't think it was good for much, and they used it as what's known as a penal colony. So a penal colony is essentially a prison colony. So the prisons in Britain were too full, and if you got arrested and they couldn't put you in prison in England, you had a choice. You could either get hanged or you could go to Australia. Shockingly, most people chose to go to Australia. And in Australia, they used it really for a lot of the raw materials that were there. They also used it for farming. Some areas are better at farming than others. But what it did was force the local Aboriginal people to move inland. Again, a lot of discrimination against the Aboriginals. Their children were stripped from them and put into British boarding schools to kind of like brainwash them into the British way of thinking. A lot of really terrible stuff go down in Australia, but Australia today is still part of the British Empire as a result. So a few other nations in Asia that we have. Britain also is going to control the islands of Burma and the nations of Malaysia and Indonesia, which they get from the Dutch. France is going to control what at that time is called Indochina. It is modern day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They also control some islands in the South Seas, specifically Tahiti and New Caledonia. Germany is going to control the Marshall Islands and Samoa. And then Spain in 1898 lost their colonies, the Philippines, Guam, and Cuba, to the United States, which we controlled for quite some time. So this kind of wraps up our basic look at imperialism. We're going to look at some of the more specific events and everything like that in class a little bit later on. But I hope that this gives you kind of a broad overscope of what imperialism looked like and where it was going on. So I'll see you in class. Goodbye.